Good morning, colleagues. I'm sorry I'm not able to join you in person. I've attended and contributed to Excel's annual conference on a number of occasions, and I know the chat outside the formal session is lively and challenging, and so I'm disappointed to miss participating in those conversations this year. However, moving on to my contribution today, I've been asked to share some reflections on a range of political events which are and will be taking place, and current political priorities, and to consider the implications for you, the procurement community. So let me begin. When Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was asked what the greatest challenge for a statesman was, he replied, "Events, dear boy, events." The same is true for most leaders and organisations, and political events are of significance. Before looking at some key national political events taking place over the next 5 years, I'll begin by considering some international geopolitical events and the global pandemic, and consider the implications of these type of political events on the procurement community. So let's begin with the pandemic. Both the United Kingdom and the Scottish Government have established independent, judge-led public inquiries under the Inquiries Act 2005 to review the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Scottish inquiry will follow terms of reference set by the Scottish ministers. These cover 12 areas of investigation, each covering a strategic element of the handling of the pandemic. And of particular interest to you will be the focus on the supply, distribution and use of personal protective equipment element. The UK inquiry also includes an examination of the procurement and distribution of key equipment and supplies, including PPE and ventilators. The pandemic has exposed the international nature of our supply chain and our vulnerability as a result. Some commentators are saying pandemic planning by both governments failed to maintain a currency in terms of commodity strategy for PPE. We will need to be alert to both public inquiries' recommendations regarding procurement, particularly PPE. Moving on to the withdrawal of military forces from Afghanistan, across the UK, local authorities have played their part to support the Home Office Afghan resettlement scheme. This built on the approach which many of us adopted previously in response to the Syrian refugee crisis. As geopolitical events occur across the world, countries are required to respond and to facilitate those fleeing such crisis on both a temporary and permanent basis. Our ability to respond quickly from a housing, health and education perspective are all challenged by the pace of these events, as well as by the limitations of the current approach to the asset and service design. And finally, the entry of Russian military forces into the Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia has produced another mass flight of people across Europe in particular. The response of Western allies via NATO has resulted in more severe economic sanctions than those imposed in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. These events have revealed Europe's dependency on Russia's exports of oil and gas, and we're seeing the US President make commitments about redirecting Europe away from Russia and towards the US for its future oil and gas needs. And whilst the UK's exposure to oil and gas is significantly lower than Europe, we are facing exposure on other commodities. The one that is absorbing a lot of attention is the supply of bitumen, and more recently sunflower oil and wheat. The procurement community must stay alert to these international geopolitical events. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been predicted by political scientists since 2014. Political scientists are also watching events in China. China claims Taiwan as its 23rd province, but it's currently an American ally. If Taiwan ever decides to declare full independence from China, which China will consider an act of war, the USA is not bound to come to its rescue, as the declaration would be considered provocative. What is our dependency on a supply chain from Taiwan? Not all international events are geopolitical. In March 2021, the Suez Canal was blocked for 6 days after the grounding of Ever Given, a 20,000 container ship. The vessel was buffeted by strong winds on the morning of the 23rd of March and ended up wedged across the waterway with its bow and stern stuck in the canal banks, blocking all traffic until it could be freed. As one of the world's busiest trade routes, the canal obstruction had a significant negative impact on trade between Europe, Asia and the Middle East. On the 28th of March, at least 369 ships were queuing to pass through the canal. This prevented an estimated $9.6 billion worth of trade. And a further phenomenon is the global crisis in terms of a growing shortage of HGV drivers. In a UK Roads Haulage Association survey, the following reasons have been attributed as the cause for the crisis: drivers retiring, the UK leaving EU, IR35, pay rates, COVID. The survey of its members estimates there is now a shortage of more than 100,000 qualified drivers just in the UK. What do these international political and non-political events mean for Scotland Excel and the procurement community? From my perspective as a Chief Executive, I need a reliable supply chain to keep the services which I'm responsible for going. And following the McClelland review, I now have a dependency on national government, Scotland Excel and the other sectoral centres of procurement expertise in order to give me that reliable supply chain. There is a collective and critical role for you to play in influencing markets, and this is growing in importance given the cost of living, scarcity of materials, energy costs. There are 4 things we need from the procurement community. We need the procurement community to work in partnership with economic development colleagues to rebalance our supply chains to reduce our exposure to international geopolitical events where possible. Where it is impossible to rebalance, then we need to think about how we approach our mitigation of risks, for example, levels of stocks maintained. We need the community to be working with the logistic industry to tackle the growing workforce risk around haulage drivers, and a community who are constantly alert and alerting delivery bodies to any risks within our supply chain. If you are to meet those 4 needs, it strikes me that you will need to collaborate even more within your procurement community, but also with others, sharing information and ideas in order to tackle some of these big challenges. Let me highlight a couple of opportunities. I recently attended a session with UK CICC. It was a conversation about how interested is the market in investing in infrastructure to support net zero transition. Through the Scottish Cities Alliance, we've been doing work to try and consolidate, aggregate the activities of Scotland's 7 cities with a view to taking that aggregated investment to the market. What I learned from the engagement with UK CICC is that the market requires the investment of approximately 50 cities in order to be interested. So it's vital that we are aggregating our demand in order to secure this kind of investment. Within Aberdeen, we've recently entered into a joint venture with BP to develop a hydrogen production centre. To get this started, we're anchoring the demand for hydrogen from a number of local public bodies. So we need aggregation of demand for assets and commodity supply. You surely must be at the heart of both as a procurement community. Another area worth considering is construction. Under the structures of Hub Co procurement vehicle, in the north we have 17 public sector bodies as members, and we're trying to explore how we can structure and join up our capital plans with each other to maximise influence and have an impact on construction inflation through giving our supply chain certainty of a pipeline. This type of cross-sector collaboration is not easy. It requires commitment, stamina and determination to seek a prize. But there is a prize. I ask you to consider what role you're playing within the HubCo structures in your area. Now let me turn to domestic political events. Let us consider the outcome of the 2022 local authority elections. I won't bother repeating the results by political party. Of more note for me is that there are 27 out of 32 councils in Scotland with no overall control. The independents held on to control across the 3 island authorities, SNP managed to take control of Dundee, and Labour control in West Dumbarton. Our use of the single transferable voting system is continuing to lead to the creation of coalitions at a local level of government. In terms of the voter turnout, in the 2012 local authority election, turnout was 39.7%. In 2017, it was 46.9%. The analysis of 2022 is not yet available. Notwithstanding the increase of just less than 8% between 2012 and 2017 elections, less than half the population are bothering to vote about the things that affect their daily lives in Scotland, compared to some 63% of the electorate who came out to vote in the 2021 Scottish Parliament elections. Important to consider the opportunities which are presented through coalitions, as well as thinking about the challenges. Now let me turn to the SNP and Green Power Sharing Agreement, which includes a commitment to hold a referendum on Scottish independence within the next 5 years, and preferably by the end of 2023. As you know, the Brexit referendum took place on the 23rd of June 2016. The UK left the EU on the 31st of January 2020. The transition period that was in place ended on the 31st of December 2020. The rules governing the new relationship between the EU and the UK took effect on the 1st of January 2021. So all in all, less than 5 years to manage the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the EU. Would a positive Scottish independence referendum vote and the consequent leave process be more or less complicated than the UK's exit from the European Union? Would a positive vote, if a referendum were to go ahead in 2023, see us exit the Union before 2028? There will be a significant market response to a positive vote. We saw how the markets responded to Brexit. Aberdeen City Council issued a bond on the London stock market back in 2016. And throughout our engagement with investors, we were asked about the political context of Scotland. Investors look for certainty and stability. It's beyond me to predict how the markets, including our supply chain, would react to both a second referendum and a positive vote from a second independence referendum. But for us all, it remains a significant backdrop, and one that I would expect you, the procurement community, to be alert to and planning for. And what are the implications of the 2nd of May 2024 UK general election, particularly now against the results of local authority and mayoral elections in England last week? And turning to the next Scottish Parliament elections on the 7th of May 26 and local authority elections in 27, the outcome of both these electoral events may depend significantly on how successful the Scottish Government has been in implementing some sizeable reforms, which it has committed to within its programme for government. The reforms will change the form and function of local government considerably, and the Government's plans for the future of local government and local governance are expected to be expressed in a local democracy bill during this parliamentary term. Now let me turn briefly to the Scottish Government's current political priorities. I think the priorities can be categorised into two themes. Firstly, a deliberate shift to a rights-based system being incorporated into Scots law. And secondly, legally enshrining preventative and reductive targets within a number of policy areas. Let me begin by looking at the shift to the rights-based system. The independent review of adult social care, the Feely Review, which informed the Government's consultation on proposals for a national care service, states the following. We want to see an end to this emphasis on price and competition, and to see the establishment of a more collaborative, participative and ethical commissioning framework for adult social care services and supports, squarely focused on achieving better outcomes for people, using these services and improving the experience of the staff delivering them. By shifting emphasis in this way, we believe Scotland can deliver social care supports more fairly and more sustainably. We expect the Government to publish its draft National Care Service Bill before the summer recess, and we'll see whether the Government plans to enshrine an ethical commissioning framework for adult social care into primary or secondary legislation. Second area is where the Government is planning to incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into law, having published a bill. The UNCRC is the gold standard across the world for children's rights. It covers all aspects of a child's life and sets out the civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights that all children everywhere are entitled to. It also explains how adults and governments must work together to make sure all children can enjoy all their rights. Incorporation will mean that public authorities must take steps to respect children's rights in their decisions and actions, and it will mean that children, young people and their representatives will be able to use courts in Scotland to enforce their rights. As a result of the Supreme Court's decision, the UNCRC bill will now be sent back to the Scottish Parliament for the issues to be reconsidered. In effect, the Scottish Parliament must now amend or abandon the provisions which the Supreme Court has judged to be out with its competence before the UNCRC bill can be enacted. A human rights bill is expected within this parliamentary term also. So Scotland Excel and yourselves as the procurement community now need to consider how to ensure your commissioning and procurement activities reflect a legally enshrined rights-based system for both children and adult services within Scots law. Moving on to the second theme, where there's a real focus on embedding prevention and reductive targets within law. There are a number of policy areas where we can see this being introduced. Colleagues will be familiar with the statutory targets to achieve a net zero in Scotland as a result of the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009, which was then subsequently amended by the 2019 Act. A Natural Environment Bill is expected to be introduced in Year 3, including legal targets for a natural restoration, and a Circular Economy Bill, which will place further requirements in law to support the emissions reduction targets. You will be aware that Scottish Government and COSLA have been consulting on proposals to introduce a statutory duty to prevent homelessness through a housing bill expected in 2023. This duty would be placed on a range of public bodies and landlords to prevent homelessness, particularly by asking and acting on a risk of homelessness, as well as responsibilities relating to strategic and joint planning. The proposals include changing existing homelessness legislation to ensure homelessness is prevented at an earlier stage, including a proposal to extend the duty to take reasonable steps to prevent homelessness up to 6 months before, to maximise the housing options available to people and to prescribe what reasonable steps may include. You may also be aware of the promise and the intention to produce three-year change plans to enable the promise to be achieved by the target date of 2030. One aspect of the promise which I wanted to draw your attention to is the following. Wherever safe to do so, Scotland will make sure children stay with their families and families will be actively supported to stay together. The wider structural and social inequalities that impact families' abilities to stay together and to thrive will be tackled so that no child or family in Scotland is left behind. You'll also be familiar that on the statute book is the Child Poverty Act of 2017, which stipulates that Scottish ministers must ensure that the 2030 targets are met in the financial year beginning 1st of April 2030. The 2030 targets are that of children living in households in Scotland, less than 10% fall within relative poverty, 5% within absolute poverty, that 5% fall within the combined low income and material deprivation, and that less than 5% fall within persistent poverty. So Scotland Excel and yourselves as the procurement community need to be influencing and challenging the planning of services across local government to achieve these legally enshrined preventative and reductive targets. Colleagues should be alert to the Scottish Government's consultation on the resource spending review framework, which sets the scene for the development of resource spending plans for the rest of the parliamentary term. The framework sets out 3 priorities around child poverty, addressing climate change and securing a stronger, fairer and greener economy. So what does this all mean for you, the procurement community? It means that you will play a role in reshaping the supply chain because of, firstly, the instability and price unpredictability we are experiencing because of the current and anticipated future geopolitical events and the pandemic. Secondly, the necessity to reduce the carbon footprint of our supply chain. And specifically, you will be required to support the reshaping of the adult social care market, with its link to the National Care Service, reshaping secure care for children, with its link to the promise, and reshaping the housing market, given the government's intention to move to net zero on homelessness. In drawing my input to a close, I'd reflect for a moment on the golden age of the Victorians. Much advancement was made across a range of issues: population health, education, transportation, and in fact we rely on much of the infrastructure created by the Victorians today. In a post-Brexit, post-pandemic, post-COP era, do we have an opportunity to match the legacy of the Victorians and to gift our successors with a legacy they can rely on to address the challenges they will face? Whether we realise the opportunity from some of the political events I've described, I guess is down in part to you, the procurement community. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.